On October 22, 1962, in the quiet streets of Bristol Borough, Pennsylvania, a 9-year-old girl named Carol Ann Dougherty pedaled her bicycle down Lincoln Avenue with the kind of innocent purpose that defines childhood. She had mystery novels to return to the library and new books to check out, the next installments in a series she couldn't put down. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalks of this working-class suburb, where everyone knew everyone, where children played freely, and where parents believed their neighborhood was immune to the darkness that plagued bigger cities. But on Lincoln Avenue, less than a block and a half from St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church, lived a man nobody suspected, a man whose past was violent, whose future would be monstrous, and whose present placed him directly in the pathway of an innocent child. By 6 o'clock that evening, Carol Ann's father would discover her body in the choir loft of St. Mark's Church, beneath a stained glass window, in a place where she had gone to pray. The killer would vanish into the American landscape for 40 years, leaving behind a family that would never heal, a community that would never forget, and a case that wouldn't find its truth for 63 years. This is the story of how a predator hid in plain sight, how a little girl's murder went unsolved for more than 6 decades, and how the answers finally came, not from technology or DNA, but from the guilty conscience of a killer's own family. Carol Ann Dougherty was the kind of child who made adults smile without trying. At 9 years old, she was a 5th grader at St. Mark's School in Bristol Borough, a small, tight-knit Catholic institution where teachers knew every student's name and parents volunteered at bake sales. She had dark hair, curious eyes, and a quiet disposition that made her teachers describe her as thoughtful, well-behaved, and deeply engaged with learning. But it was her love of reading that truly defined her. Carol Ann devoured books the way other children devoured candy. Mystery novels, in particular, captivated her imagination. She would check out books from the Bristol Borough Free Library and series, racing through each volume with the determination of someone desperate to solve the puzzle before the detective did. Nancy Drew adventures lined her bedroom bookshelf. Stories of young sleuths uncovering hidden truths fueled her daydreams. She would ride her bicycle to the library regularly, a small ritual that combined independence with intellectual curiosity, 2 things her parents, Frank and his wife, encouraged wholeheartedly. The Dougherty family embodied the values of their community: faith, family, and hard work. Frank Dougherty worked long hours to provide for his 2 daughters, Carol Ann and her younger sister Kay, who was only 3 years old in 1962. The family attended Mass at St. Mark's Church every Sunday, sitting in the same pew, praying together, participating in the rituals that connected them to generations of Catholic tradition. Carol Ann took her faith seriously, internalizing the lessons her parents and teachers taught her about kindness, obedience, and devotion. One habit her parents had instilled in her was particularly poignant. Whenever Carol Ann passed a church, any church, she would stop, make the sign of the cross, and say a quiet prayer. It was a small act of reverence, a momentary pause in her day to acknowledge the sacred. Her parents never imagined that this act of devotion would lead their daughter into the hands of a killer. Carol Ann's routine was predictable, and in 1962, predictability meant safety. She knew the route to the library by heart. Down Lincoln Avenue, past the small shops and homes where neighbors waved from porches, past Tommy's convenience store where she'd stop for a Coke and penny candy, and onward toward the welcoming doors of the library. She didn't need supervision. 9-year-olds in Bristol Borough rode their bicycles alone, played in the streets until the streetlights came on, and returned home when their mothers called them for dinner. The world felt safe because it was supposed to be. But Carol Ann's world was about to shatter, and the man who would destroy it had been watching. The afternoon of October 22, 1962, unfolded like any other autumn Tuesday in Bristol Borough. The temperature was mild. The leaves were beginning their transformation from green to gold, and children were finishing their school day with the anticipation of homework, after-school play, and the evening routines that structured their young lives. For Carol Ann Dougherty, the plan was simple: return her library books, check out new ones, and get home in time for dinner. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, Carol Ann kissed her mother goodbye, grabbed her books, and climbed onto her bicycle. She wore simple clothes, the kind of practical outfit that mothers dressed their daughters in during the early 1960s, and carried her library books in a small basket attached to her handlebars. Her mother watched her pedal away, down the street, toward Lincoln Avenue. There was no reason to worry. There was never a reason to worry. Carol Ann's first stop was Tommy's convenience store on Lincoln Avenue, a small corner shop that sold sodas, candy, and the kinds of snacks that made childhood errands feel like adventures. She walked inside, her small frame barely reaching the counter, and ordered a Coke and some penny candy. The store clerk remembered her, a polite, quiet girl who said please and thank you without prompting. She paid, collected her treats, and walked back outside into the afternoon sunlight. From there, she continued her journey toward the library, pedaling slowly, savoring her Coke, unaware that someone was watching. William Schrader lived on Lincoln Avenue, less than a block and a half from St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church. At 24 years old, he was a man with a violent past that his neighbors knew nothing about. He had been convicted of attempted murder years earlier, had been dishonorably discharged from the Army after just 1 year of service, and had served time at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, one of the most notorious prisons in American history. After his release, he had quietly settled into Bristol Borough, living with family members, blending into the fabric of a community that had no idea what kind of predator walked among them. On this particular afternoon, Schrader saw Carol Ann. Whether he had seen her before, whether he had studied her routine, whether he had planned this moment or acted on impulse, these are questions that would haunt investigators for decades. What is known is that Carol Ann, riding her bicycle down Lincoln Avenue, passed St. Mark's Church around 3:30 in the afternoon, and as she had been taught, she stopped to pray. St. Mark's Church stood as a monument to faith and community, its stone facade rising above the modest homes that surrounded it. Inside, the sanctuary was quiet, dim, and filled with the kind of reverence that makes people whisper even when no service is being held. The pews were empty. The altar stood in stillness, and above, accessible by a narrow staircase, was the choir loft, a secluded space beneath stained glass windows where the church choir would gather on Sundays to sing hymns of worship and praise. Carol Ann entered the church. Whether she was lured inside by Schrader, whether she saw him and trusted him because he was a familiar face from the neighborhood, or whether he simply followed her inside, these details remain unknown. What is certain is that William Schrader was inside St. Mark's Church that afternoon, and what happened next would destroy a family, traumatize a community, and remain unsolved for 63 years. The attack occurred in the choir loft. Carol Ann was sexually assaulted. She fought back. Investigators would later find male pubic hairs clutched in her small hand, evidence of a desperate struggle. And then, to silence her, to prevent her from identifying him, William Schrader strangled her to death with a ligature. Her body was left beneath a stained glass window, in a place meant to offer sanctuary, in a space where children were supposed to be safe. When Carol Ann didn't return home by 4:30, the time her family expected her for dinner, her mother began to worry. By 5 o'clock, worry had turned to fear. By 5:30, Frank Dougherty was out searching the streets, retracing his daughter's route, calling her name, checking with neighbors and shopkeepers. And at 6 o'clock, driven by a father's intuition and a growing sense of dread, Frank entered St. Mark's Church. He climbed the stairs to the choir loft, And there, beneath the colored light filtering through stained glass, he found his daughter's body. The scream that tore from Frank Dougherty's throat echoed through the empty church, a sound of anguish so primal that it seemed to crack the very foundation of the sacred space. Neighbors came running, police were called, and within minutes, St. Mark's Church, a place of prayer and peace, became a crime scene. The Bristol Borough Police Department, led by Chief Vincent Faragalli, arrived at St. Mark's Church within minutes of the call. The scene they encountered was every law enforcement officer's nightmare. A child's body, a sexual assault, a murder in broad daylight in a place that should have been inviolable. The Pennsylvania State Police were immediately brought in to assist, and detectives began the painstaking work of collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and trying to make sense of the senseless. The physical evidence was limited, but significant. Male pubic hairs were found clutched in Carol Ann's hand, indicating that she had fought back against her attacker. A ligature had been used to strangle her, though the exact instrument was never conclusively identified. Lucky Strike cigarettes were found at the scene, a detail that seemed minor but would later become important. The crime had occurred around 3:35 in the afternoon. Placing it in a narrow window of time when most people were at work, children were heading home from school, and the church was likely empty. Detectives immediately began canvassing the neighborhood. Had anyone seen Carol Ann? Had anyone seen a suspicious person near the church? Had anyone heard screams or sounds of a struggle? The answers were frustratingly vague. Bristol Borough was a community where people noticed things, where neighbors kept watch over each other's children, where strangers stood out. But on this particular afternoon, no one had seen anything unusual, or so they claimed. Within the first few weeks of the investigation, police identified several potential suspects. Frank Zucchero, a local man known for drinking and erratic behavior, quickly became a focus. Zucchero had been seen near the church around the time of the murder, and under pressure from police interrogation, he confessed. But his confession was immediately suspect. Zucchero was described as slow, uneducated, and unable to provide specific details about the crime that only the killer would know. Police quickly determined that his confession was unreliable. The desperate words of a man trying to please his interrogators, or perhaps suffering from mental illness. He was cleared. Another suspect emerged when a teenager named Wayne Roach's parents reported finding Carol Ann's name written in his notebook. Roach was 19 years old, and the discovery sent shockwaves through his family. But after thorough investigation, police determined that the notebook entry was coincidental, perhaps the result of a school assignment or innocent note-taking. Roach was cleared. Then there was Father Joseph Sabadish, a priest at St. Mark's Church. The idea that a man of God could commit such an atrocity was almost too horrifying to contemplate, but investigators had to follow every lead. Father Sabadish's alibi initially appeared questionable, and his access to the church made him a logical suspect. But after extensive investigation, including polygraph tests and witness corroboration, Father Sabadish was also cleared, and then there was William Schrader. Within 2 months of Carol Ann's murder, detectives questioned Schrader because a witness had reported seeing him outside St. Mark's Church around the time of the crime. When asked to provide an alibi, Schrader claimed he had been at work. It was a simple statement, easily verifiable. Detectives contacted his employer and requested his time card records. The result was damning. Schrader had not been at work on October 22, 1962. He had lied. Confronted with this inconsistency, Schrader agreed to provide a pubic hair sample for comparison with the evidence found in Carol Ann's hand. He also agreed to take a polygraph test. The results were telling. Schrader failed the polygraph. The examiner noted signs of deception, physiological responses that suggested Schrader was lying about his involvement in Carol Ann's murder. By any reasonable standard, William Schrader should have been arrested. He had no alibi. He had been seen near the crime scene. He had failed a polygraph test. He had provided a pubic hair sample that could not be conclusively excluded. But in 1962, forensic science was in its infancy. DNA analysis didn't exist. Hair comparison was subjective and often inadmissible in court. Polygraph results were not considered definitive evidence. And most importantly, investigators didn't have enough concrete proof to charge him with murder. Schrader knew the walls were closing in, and so he did what guilty men often do. He ran. Within weeks of his police interview, William Schrader left Bristol Borough. He fled to Florida first, disappearing into the anonymity of a state where no one knew his name, no one knew his face, and no one was looking for him. He lived there for a year, working odd jobs, keeping a low profile, watching the news to see if Pennsylvania authorities were coming for him. They weren't. The investigation had stalled. The leads had dried up, and Carol Ann Dougherty's murder became a cold case. For the Dougherty family, the lack of answers was its own form of torture. Frank and his wife buried their daughter, attended memorials, and tried to hold their lives together for the sake of their 3-year-old daughter, Kay. But the question, who killed Carol Ann, haunted every moment of their existence. Frank would spend the rest of his life wondering if he had missed something, if there was something he could have done differently, if the man who murdered his daughter was walking free somewhere in America, living a normal life while Carol Ann's life had been stolen. The years passed. The 1960s became the 1970s. The investigation file on Carol Ann Dougherty grew dusty in the archives of the Bristol Borough Police Department. Detectives retired. New cases took priority. And William Schrader, living under the radar in Louisiana, continued to destroy lives. William Schrader didn't stop. Predators rarely do. On October 31st, 1970, exactly 8 years after Carol Ann's murder, Schrader committed another horrific crime. He was living in Houma, Louisiana, renting a house where his stepdaughter and her friend, a 9-year-old girl named Catherine Marie Smith, were staying. That Halloween night, witnesses would later recall hearing Schrader tell his wife something chilling. If she be there at the house when he gets there, that he's going to set it on fire. He did exactly that. Schrader set fire to the house using an accelerant, deliberately and methodically. The flames consumed the structure, and by the time firefighters arrived, Catherine Marie Smith was dead. Schrader's stepdaughter survived but suffered permanent brain damage, a lifelong consequence of Schrader's evil. Fire investigators quickly determined that the blaze had been intentionally set, and witnesses pointed to Schrader as the perpetrator. But remarkably, stunningly, he was not immediately arrested. It would take 15 years, before Schrader was finally charged with Catherine Smith's death. In 1985, following a domestic dispute with his wife, law enforcement finally had enough evidence to move forward. Schrader was arrested, tried, and convicted of manslaughter and arson. He was sentenced to 21 years in Angola State Penitentiary, one of the most notorious prisons in America, a place where the worst of the worst were sent to serve their time. But even behind bars, the full scope of William Schrader's depravity was only beginning to emerge. District Attorney Jennifer Shorn would later describe Schrader's life with words that chilled investigators to the bone. Schrader's life was marked by a pattern of violence and sexual violence, particularly against young, prepubescent, and adolescent females. He had, over the course of decades, sexually abused nearly every female child he lived with or had access to, including his own biological daughter and granddaughters. The generational trauma Schrader inflicted is almost impossible to comprehend. Children who should have been protected were victimized. Daughters who should have been cherished were violated. Granddaughters who should have been safe were abused. Schrader's predation didn't end with Catherine Smith's death, or even with his imprisonment. His legacy of violence rippled outward, scarring families, destroying childhoods, and leaving emotional wreckage that would last for generations. In 2002, William Schrader died in Angola State Penitentiary at the age of 62. He had served 17 years of his 21-year sentence. He died without ever being charged for Carol Ann Dougherty's murder. He died without confessing publicly to the crime that had haunted Bristol Borough for 4 decades. And for the Dougherty family, still waiting for answers, his death felt like the final injustice. The man who had destroyed their lives had escaped justice entirely. But Carol Ann's case didn't die with Schrader. In 1993, Pennsylvania authorities made a decision that would prove crucial decades later. They conducted an unprecedented forensic review of the evidence, focusing on the male pubic hairs that had been clutched in Carol Ann's hand for 31 years. Over the course of the investigation, 141 men had been questioned, investigated, or considered as suspects. Authorities had collected hair samples from many of them, and in 1993, forensic analysts set out to conduct a comprehensive comparison. One by one, suspects were tested. One by one, they were eliminated. The hair evidence didn't match. The biological profile didn't align. And when the analysis was complete, 140 men had been definitively excluded as the source of the hair found in Carol Ann's hand. But one man could not be excluded: William Schrader. The significance of this finding cannot be overstated. In a pool of 141 suspects accumulated over 3 decades, Schrader was the only individual whose biological evidence was consistent with the crime scene. But here's the cruel reality of 1993 forensic technology. The analysis could eliminate suspects, but it couldn't definitively prove guilt. DNA extraction from hair shafts was still developing. The evidence could say it wasn't these 140 men, but it couldn't say with certainty it was William Schrader. Still, it was enough to bring him back under scrutiny. In 1994, a grand jury was convened to re-examine Carol Ann Dougherty's murder. The 2 primary suspects were Father Joseph Sabadish and William Schrader. Both men were brought in for questioning. Schrader had to be extradited from Louisiana, where he was still serving his sentence for Catherine Smith's death. Both men were polygraphed again, and both men, remarkably, passed their polygraph tests. The grand jury declined to indict. The case went cold again, but something interesting was happening in the background. Something that would prove essential to finally solving Carol Ann's murder. Journalists refused to let the story die. J.D. Mullane, a reporter for the Bucks County Courier-Times, had been writing about Carol Ann's case since the 1990s. Every anniversary of her death, he published articles reminding the community that justice had not been served. He interviewed family members, spoke with investigators, and kept the case in the public consciousness. His persistence meant that Carol Ann Dougherty was not forgotten. Then, in 2024, something extraordinary happened. Mike Missinelli, a sports radio host whose uncle had been the police chief in Bristol Borough in 1962, decided to produce a podcast about Carol Ann's case. The podcast was extensive, 14 episodes, and it delved deeply into every aspect of the investigation, the suspects, the evidence, and the family's suffering. The podcast went viral within the true crime community, bringing national attention to a case that had been confined to local memory for decades. The renewed media attention caught the attention of the Bucks County District Attorney's Office. Cold case detectives decided to take one more look at the evidence. And this time, they made a decision that would change everything. They decided to interview family members of William Schrader, who had died 22 years earlier. In November 2024, investigators from the Bucks County District Attorney's Office and the Pennsylvania State Police sat down with Robert LeBlanc, William Schrader's stepson. LeBlanc was now an older man himself, carrying decades of secrets, guilt, and the weight of knowledge that no one should have to bear. The investigators asked him a simple question. Did your stepfather ever talk about Carol Ann Dougherty? What LeBlanc revealed in that interview would finally bring the truth to light. LeBlanc told investigators that William Schrader had confessed to him, not once, but twice, about murdering a little girl in a Pennsylvania church. The confessions had come at different times over the years, moments when Schrader, perhaps drunk or perhaps overwhelmed by his own guilt, had let the truth slip out. According to LeBlanc, Schrader had described the crime in chilling detail. He said he had lured the girl inside the church. He said he had raped her, and he said he had killed her because he had to keep her from talking. The specificity of the confession was what convinced investigators of its authenticity. LeBlanc knew details about the crime that had never been released to the public. He knew that Schrader had been seen outside the church. He knew about the location of Carol Ann's bicycle. He knew about the choir loft. These were not details that someone could guess or fabricate. These were the words of a man who had been told the truth by the killer himself. Investigators pressed LeBlanc. "Why are you coming forward now? Why did you wait so long?" LeBlanc's answer was heartbreaking in its simplicity. He had been afraid. Afraid of his stepfather. Afraid of what might happen to his family. Afraid of being implicated. But now, with Schrader dead for more than 2 decades, with his own conscience eating away at him, and with the renewed media attention reminding him that a family still had no answers, LeBlanc decided it was time to speak. The investigators believed him. Every piece of evidence they had collected over 62 years, the failed alibi, the failed polygraph, the hair evidence, the eyewitness who saw Schrader near the church, the Lucky Strike cigarettes that matched his smoking brand, the pattern of violence against 9-year-old girls, all of it aligned with LeBlanc's account. William Schrader had murdered Carol Ann Dougherty, and now, finally, they could prove it. On October 27, 2025, the Bucks County Investigating Grand Jury convened to review the complete case file on Carol Ann Dougherty's murder. They examined every piece of evidence: the 1962 crime scene reports, the witness statements, the forensic hair analysis from 1993, the failed alibi, the failed polygraph, the 1970 murder of Catherine Smith, the pattern of generational sexual abuse, and most importantly, Robert LeBlanc's testimony about Schrader's confessions. The grand jury deliberated. They weighed the evidence. They considered the standard of proof. And they reached a conclusion. The grand jury approved a comprehensive 53-page report that officially identified William Schrader as the man who raped and murdered Carol Ann Dougherty on October 22, 1962, 2 days later. On October 29, 2025, District Attorney Jennifer Shorn stood before a room full of journalists, investigators, and Carol Ann's surviving family members to announce the findings. Her words were measured but powerful. Findings. Her words were measured but powerful. Unbeknownst to Carol Ann, and unbeknownst to everyone in Bristol Borough, living on Lincoln Avenue was an absolute predator, and a predator whose prey was little girls. And that was William Schrader. The room was silent. 63 years of waiting, of wondering, of grief without closure had finally led to this moment. William Schrader could not be arrested. He could not stand trial. He could not be sentenced. But he had been identified, officially and conclusively, as Carol Ann's killer. For the first time since 1962, the Dougherty family had an answer. Standing beside District Attorney Shorn was Kay Dougherty Talanka, Carol Ann's younger sister. Kay had been only 3 years old when her sister was murdered. She had grown up in the shadow of an unsolved tragedy, in a home where grief was a constant presence, where the question, "Who killed Carol Ann?" hung in the air like smoke that never cleared. Kay's parents had died without ever knowing the truth. Her father, Frank, who had discovered his daughter's body in that church choir loft, had gone to his grave carrying the weight of unanswered questions. Her mother had spent decades wondering if the man who killed her daughter was someone she passed on the street, someone who lived nearby, someone who had looked her in the eye and lied. Now, Kay stood before the cameras and spoke publicly for the first time about what this moment meant. "My family lived without answers," she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "And the uncertainty surrounding Carol's death became a part of who we were. My parents both passed away without knowing on this earth who murdered their daughter." She paused, gathering herself, and continued. "After so many decades of unknowing, this finding finally brings closure and a truth to a wound that never healed. Though nothing can bring Carol back, we can finally let her rest in peace, knowing that her story has been told, her truth revealed, and her memory honored." The courtroom, the press conference room, the community watching from home, everyone understood the magnitude of what Kay was saying. This wasn't just about solving a cold case. This was about a family that had spent 63 years living in limbo, unable to grieve properly because the truth had been withheld from them. This was about parents who had died carrying the unbearable weight of not knowing. This was about a little sister who had spent her entire life defined by the tragedy that took her big sister away. For the Bristol Borough community, the revelation brought a mix of emotions. Relief, certainly. The mystery had finally been solved. But also anger. William Schrader had lived among them. He had walked the same streets as Carol Ann. He had been questioned within 2 months of the murder, had failed a polygraph, had lied about his alibi, and yet had been allowed to flee. He had gone on to kill again, to abuse countless children, to spread his violence across state lines and generations. How many lives could have been saved if he had been arrested in 1962? These are the questions that haunt cold case investigators, prosecutors, and families. The what-ifs and if-onlys that can drive a person to despair. But Kay Dougherty Talanka, in her statement, chose to focus not on what was lost, but on what had finally been found. The truth. In the days following the announcement, media coverage of Carol Ann's case exploded. National news outlets picked up the story. True crime podcasts dedicated episodes to the case. Online communities dissected the evidence, debated the investigation, and expressed outrage at the system failures that had allowed Schrader to evade justice for so long. But through it all, Carol Ann's name was spoken with reverence. She was no longer just the girl who was murdered in 1962. She was Carol Ann Dougherty, a child who loved mystery novels, who rode her bicycle to the library, who stopped to pray when she passed a church, who had dreams and a future that were stolen from her. The Bristol Borough Free Library, where Carol Ann had been heading on that October afternoon in 1962, now holds a small memorial in her honor. The books she loved, the mystery novels she read with such enthusiasm, have been donated by community members who wanted to ensure that her passion for reading would be remembered. St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church, where her life ended so violently, has held memorial services acknowledging the tragedy and praying for her soul. And Lincoln Avenue, the street where a predator once lived undetected, is now a place where residents speak her name and remember. For Kay Dougherty Talanka, the journey is not over. She has become an advocate for cold case victims' families, speaking at events and supporting legislation that funds cold case units and forensic advancements. She has said, in interviews since the announcement, that she wishes her parents could have lived to see this day. But she also believes, in her heart, that they know that wherever they are, they finally have peace. J.D. Mullane, the journalist who kept Carol Ann's story alive for decades, wrote a final column about the case. In it, he reflected on the power of persistence, the importance of never forgetting, and the responsibility that journalists have to give voice to the voiceless. He wrote, "Carol Ann Dougherty deserved justice. She deserved to be remembered. And she deserved a community that would never stop looking for the truth." Mike Missinelli, whose podcast reignited interest in the case, said in his final episode, "This is why we tell these stories, not to sensationalize tragedy, but to honor the victims and give their families the closure they deserve. Carol Ann's story is not about William Schrader. It's about a little girl who loved books, who rode her bike to the library, and who should have come home that day. 63 years is a lifetime. It's long enough for children to grow old, for parents to die, for memories to fade, and buildings to crumble. But some stories refuse to be forgotten. Some voices, even when silenced, continue to echo through the decades, demanding to be heard. Carol Ann Dougherty's voice has finally been heard. She was 9 years old when she died, the same age as Catherine Marie Smith, the other little girl William Schrader killed. Both girls were robbed of their futures, their potential, their chance to grow up and experience the fullness of life. But while Schrader's name will be remembered only as a footnote in the annals of evil, Carol Ann's name will be remembered as a symbol of resilience, of a community's refusal to forget, and of a family's enduring love. The stained glass window in St. Mark's Church, the one beneath which Carol Ann's body was found, still filters light into the choir loft. But now, when that light falls across the wooden floor, it feels different. It feels like memory. It feels like justice, delayed but not denied. It feels like a little girl who can finally rest, knowing that the truth has been told and her name has been honored. Frank Dougherty never got to see his daughter's killer identified, but he spent his final years knowing that investigators never gave up, that journalists never stopped writing, and that his community never forgot. That has to count for something. Kay Dougherty Talanka carries her sister's memory forward, speaking her name, telling her story, ensuring that Carol Ann is more than a statistic in a cold case file. She is a person, a sister, a daughter, a child who loved mystery novels and dreamed of solving puzzles. In a tragic twist of fate, the greatest mystery of her life was her own death, and it took 63 years to solve. The murder of Carol Ann Dougherty is a reminder that justice does not have an expiration date, that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing, that families who wait for answers deserve to receive them, even if it takes a lifetime, and that the children we lose should never be forgotten, no matter how many years pass. William Schrader is dead, but Carol Ann Dougherty is remembered, and in the end, that is its own form of justice.